Howdy, and welcome back to my channel. I'm back for video 2 of 3 of my 6 Halloween dresses project, and in this one we're doing something a little bit different. This time the dresses will have button fronts and sleeves. The black and white one is covered in little playing cards with creepy motifs. It's from Joann's, and the other is a really fun print covered with white, orange, and red pumpkins on a black backdrop that I picked up at just the local Walmart. The first step, as always, is to cut out the fabric from my pattern. This is another self-drafted pattern based on the first pattern I used for this series, but with a button placket down the front and some elbow-length sleeves added. I'm using Sharpie on the black and white dress. It's not my first choice, but this fabric is covered in little black dots that makes it really hard to see other methods of marking on. And then for the orange one, I simply used chalk. I marked all the darts on these pieces, and then I also cut out 2 bodices out of some plain black cotton that I used for lining these pieces, and I only bothered to film the one set being cut out because it's absolutely identical. I also decided to cut out some cuffs. I had originally cut them out of the black and white fabric, but then decided that it would look better with a contrasting cuff on that black and white fabric and decided against it with the other orange dress. For the skirts on these two, I decided on a pleated skirt for the black and white dress, which worked out significantly better for me because I wasn't attempting to do any fancy flaring, just basic half-inch wide pleats. And for the orange fabric, I decided on a paneled skirt similar to the one on the gray dress in my previous video. With those cut out, I started assembling my bodices. First step was to do up the shoulder seams and the darts on both of them, and then begin the kind of confusing method that I generally use to attach my sleeves. Now, I said the method that I use here is kind of confusing, and it is. It's confusing because I don't do the typical assemble bodice and then set in the sleeve method. What I'm doing here is pinning the sleeves to the arm sky before the side seams are ever done up. Then, once they're pinned in, I leave an inch or so at either end open so that I can do up those side seams and the French seam in the arm itself up after this step. I've left the neckline open, so once it's set in, I kind of do a bunch of mental gymnastics until I'm sure I've got things the right way pinned, and then I stitch the lining to the other pieces in the same way with the sleeve allowances all together in a sandwich, so that the sleeve seam allowance will be nice and trapped in that shoulder seam with everything else, and it'll look very neat and hidden away in the finished piece. I cut the darts off with pinking shears and sewed the French seams at the bottom of the sleeves very carefully, followed by sewing the lining to the lining, the fashion fabric to the fashion fabric at the side seams. I made up the cuffs, and I did sew up that little bit of extra space in the sleeves. It wants to sort itself out quite easily, but I don't know where that footage went. And then I went through, did up the cuffs, and attached the cuffs to the sleeves on the bodice, turning them upwards in order to finish that seam, and turning up the orange ones twice in order to finish them quite neatly. The skirt for the black and white dress is 2 panels that I used the selvages at the center back for finishing with, and then pleated them down with 1/2-inch pleats, which made it approximately the size of my bodice. And then I cut off the extra because that was finished with the bias binding placket, so I wouldn't have to worry about any extra finishing techniques. For convenience's sake, I decided to just pleat all of my pleats down to each other before I actually stitched them to the waistband, and then I got to work on French seaming all of those panels together for the orange skirt, sewing them, ironing them, turning them around, and then sewing them again. And then I was ready to attach both of my bodices onto my skirts. all that ready, it was time to start stitching my button plackets, which for this project is just some bias tape sewn onto the edges. For the orange dress, I decided that I'd like a contrasting binding of just plain black fabric to make my orange buttons stand out more that I wanted so eagerly to use on this dress. And for the black and white ones, I cut out some bias tape out of the fabric itself, and I'm really pleased with how that looks as well. With the button plackets ready, it was time to do the buttons and the buttonholes. For the black and white dress, I just decided on some plain black buttons that were, I think, 1/2 inch wide, nothing too groundbreaking, and did all of the buttonholes on my sewing machine, just using its automatic one-step buttonhole foot, which you can see me struggling with right here because oh boy, did I struggle. The ones on the orange dress turned out kind of better, and I decided to use some very contrasting 1/2 inch bright orange buttons on that because I thought it would add a bit more fun to it. I cut all the buttonholes open using a seam ripper, and if you're worried about going through the far end of the buttonhole, you can actually use a pin just to stop that from happening, and then used just a little bit of fray check in order to prevent any further fraying around my buttonholes. And then for my last couple of steps with these guys, hemming at the bottom of each, and then just sewing the remainder of that button placket closed so that they would actually stay closed when the dress was worn. I also sewed the linings down off camera and put all the buttons on because that just took way too long. That's another task that I did at work while my boss was on vacation for lack of much else better to do. For my final thoughts on this dress, I'm not as in love with these as the other two. The fit isn't as nice because I didn't test this pattern before I got started, so the necklines were doing a little bit of gapage, and I can't raise my arms in either, because I had a momentous drafting revelation about sleeves while doing the pattern for the final two dresses. I couldn't figure out what's wrong with these. The pumpkin one is also just not a good color for me, and very cool toned, doubly so with my hair bleached out white, and it makes me look very weird. I'll probably fix the black and white dress in the future, as that's the one I'm significantly happier with, and I really, really love that print. But if anyone can salvage something out of that pumpkin fabric, hit me up. It's drizzling on my sock.